In this lecture video, I'm going to be looking at some of the skepticism present in the Zhuangzi. The Zhuangzi is an early Daoist text that followed the Tao Te Ching. It is believed to have been written by a person named Zhuangzi, although there is some doubt about this, that perhaps the Zhuangzi was also written by the same author of the Tao Te Ching. But if there was a Zhuangzi who wrote this, they lived roughly 369 BCE to roughly 286 BCE. And so what I want to look at is specifically the skepticism, right? So the arguments against the ability for human beings to ever truly know anything at all. Not just epistemological skepticism, but also moral skepticism and some of the ways this might seem to embrace a kind of moral relativism, but really any relativism is going to be based in skepticism. So we could first look at what Zhuangzi argues are the presumptions of the mind, the way in which human beings associate everything from their own perspective. When we say we know anything at all, our knowledge of things is always from a certain perspective. My perspective is different from yours different from mine. So we come to learn things about the world differently. One question we might want to ask, which might seem a bit absurd, is what is it like to be a bird? Now we might think, like, what relevance does a kind of question like that have? What is it like to be a bird? But the Zhuangzi actually begins with this fascinating passage here about a fish named Kun, right? In the ways in which this fish transforms into a bird named Peng, right? In the ways in which the experience of the bird of the world, right, can be completely different from our own experiences. So just to read some of this, right? There's a fish in the northern oblivion named Kun, and this Kun is quite huge, spanning who knows how many thousands of miles. He transforms into a bird named Peng, and this Peng has quite a back on him, stretching who knows how many thousands of miles. When he rouses himself and soars into the air, his wings are like clouds draped across the heavens. The oceans start to churn, and this bird begins his journey toward the southern oblivion. The southern oblivion, that is the pool of heaven. The Equalizing Joke Book, a record of many wanderers, reports when Peng journeys to the southern oblivion, the waters ripple for 3,000 miles. Spiraling aloft, he ascends 90,000 miles and continues his journey without rest for half a year. It's a galloping heat haze. It's a swirl of dust. It's some living creature blown aloft on a breath of the air. And the blue on blue of the sky, is that the sky's true color? Or is it just the vast distance going on and on without end that looks that way? When Peng looks down, he too sees only this and nothing more. So we should already be seeing a way in which the bird, right, just goes along with the flow of the air in the sky, drifting along. Now, if water is not piled up thickly enough, it has no power to support a large vessel. Overturn a cupful of water in a hole in the road and you can float a mustard seed in it like a boat. But if you put the cup itself in there, it will just get stuck. The water is too shallow for so large a vessel. And if the wind is not piled up thickly enough, it has no power to support Peng's enormous wings. That is why he needs to put 90,000 miles of air beneath him. Only then can he ride the wind, bearing the blue of heaven on his back and unobstructed on all sides and making his way south. The cicada and the fledgling dove laugh at him, saying, "We scurry up into the air, leaping from the elm to the sandalwood tree, and when we don't quite make it, we just plummet to the ground. What's all this about ascending 90,000 miles and heading south?" If you go out on a day trip, you can return with your belly still full. If you're traveling 100 miles, you'll need to bring a day's meal. And if you're traveling 1,000 miles, you'll need to save up provisions for 3 months before you go. So, some of the questions that arise about this kind of a story here is, one, it's going to question what we can know, because it's saying, look, there's this bird that has to put 90,000 miles in between them and the earth to be able to fly. So the experience that bird is going to have of the earth, it's going to be very different from, a normal sized bird that laughs at the big bird saying, that's ridiculous, you don't need to do that. Because from the perspective of the little bird, right, they don't need to have 90,000 miles, and they think what the big bird has to do is ridiculous. So one question that we can ask is, whether or not any of those birds has the correct perspective. One sense that we get is that there is no such thing as the right perspective, that it's a matter of use. The way in which these different birds are created such that their form of life interacts with the world determines how they understand the world. But it would be ridiculous to say that what the big bird paying does is correct, and what the small birds do, not putting 90,000 miles between them and the earth, is wrong. That what they know of the earth, they don't really know of the earth. Only the big bird knows of the earth, right? And there are certain ways then in which the big bird might get a larger view of the world, but they don't have the close detail that the smaller bird has. Now, what does it mean if we cannot know the kind of experience that the big bird paying has of the world, right? If we can't know what it's like to be a bird, right? How do we know what it's like to be another human being? Just because we're a human being, do we know what it's like for all human beings to know? We can also ask the question, what is it, does a bird know what it's like to be a fish? Now this fish transforms into a bird, something a bit strange. But there's also a completely different form of life. Imagine what a fish must think about how the world is compared to how a bird thinks how the world is. So all these questions, right? If we don't know what it's like to be a bird, right? Or if we don't know what we can say, or if we can't even say anything at all about this idea that the small bird really knows how the world is, or the big bird paying really knows how the world is, then what does this mean for the ability for humans to know at all? So Zhuangzi says, what do these two little creatures know? A small consciousness cannot keep up with the vast consciousness. Short duration cannot keep up with long duration. How do we know? The morning mushroom knows nothing of the noontide. The winter cicada knows nothing of the spring and autumn. So, in the way that the little bird cannot know anything of the consciousness of the big bird paying, we can also ask, how do we human beings who live for such a finite amount of time, how can we ever truly know, right, anything for certain if the world is always changing and we die, right? Then is our knowledge of the world only as good as for as long as we live? Now, we might want to think that we can use, maybe math or tools or reason, logic, right? These things can let us know certain truths about the world. But another question we have to ask is our ability to understand how logic works, or math, or whatever else, right? How do we know that we aren't missing a sense faculty, whether a sense faculty in the sense of the five senses, or a sense faculty in the sense of the mind, the way the mind understands things, that gives us more accurate knowledge of reality? How do we not know, or how do we know that we have access to everything that makes sense of the world in all its totality? Right? Zhuangzi says, the blind have no access to the beauty of visual patterns, and the deaf have no part in the sounds of bells and drums. It is not only the physical body that can be blind and dead. The faculty of understanding can also be blind and deaf to a certain sense, right? So you might say, well, okay, the blind can have some sense of visual patterns even if they can't see it, because other people who aren't blind can tell them about it. But what if there are human beings that are missing a sixth sense that would actually allow us to, have a greater understanding of the world? Well, we would never know about that. And we would go around, as we do now, with this presumption that we have full access to the world as it actually is. It's only when we are informed by some being that might perhaps have a sixth sense that we start to, although we might think that this person is crazy, but it's only potentially then that we start to realize, oh, maybe we don't actually have access to full reality. Furthermore, how do I know I'm not dreaming right now? I mean, we can think about when we dream, we have desires. It many times seems like we just go along in our dream, right? With we might think some weird things are going on, but we never fully know we're out of the dream until we wake up. But how do we know when we wake up we're not really still in a larger dream, right? The question is, what kind of reference do we have outside of ourselves? So Zhuangzi says, once Zhuangzi dreamt he was a butterfly, fluttering about joyfully just as a butterfly would. He followed his whims exactly as he liked and knew nothing about Zhuangzi. Suddenly he awoke, and there he was, the startled Zhuangzi in the flesh. He did not know if Zhou had been dreaming he was a butterfly, or if a butterfly was now dreaming it was Zhou. Surely Zhou and a butterfly count as two distinct identities. Such is what we call the transformation of one thing into another. But how do we know in this transformation, right? How do we know for sure that Zhuangzi really isn't a butterfly? Now, Zhuangzi would need access to something beyond Zhuangzi's own capabilities. In the same way, for human beings to ever truly know anything at all, right, they need access to something beyond human beings themselves. But how is this possible? Again, right, the only way I can say I'm not dreaming right now is because I had the experience of waking up. But how do I know that experience was not just part of another dream, right? So there's more and more doubt by these questions that are being put into our minds by Zhuangzi here. Now, again, with this idea that, well, oftentimes we compare our experiences with the experiences of others, and that's how we learn. But how do I know that there are other perspectives or other minds that I can learn from? So here in the outer chapters, there's this story. So Zhuangzi and Huizi were strolling along the bridge over the Hao River. Zhuangzi said, "The minnows swim about so freely, following the openings wherever they take them. Such is the happiness of fish." Huizi said, "You are not a fish, so whence do you know the happiness of fish?" Zhuangzi said, "You are not I, so whence do you not know? So whence do you know I don't know the happiness of fish?" Huizi said, "I am not you, to be sure, so I don't know what it is to be you. But by the same token, since you are certainly not a fish, my point about your inability to know the happiness of fish stands intact." Zhuangzi said, "Let's go back to the starting point. You said, whence do you know the happiness of fish? Since your question was premised on your knowing that I know it, I must have known it from here, up above the Hao River." So what's fascinating about this little back and forth here is, first, we have Zhuangzi, right, saying, look, I in my experience, I see what I take to be other fish being happy, and they're swimming around in the river. Now, this might be because I am mirroring my own experience of what, if I was swimming around in the river, I would be happy. So I only understand the other fish through my own experience, right? Now, Huizi comes along and says, well, that's ridiculous. You're not a fish. How could you actually know, whether those fish are happy or not? And what Zhuangzi says is, let's go back to the starting point. When the question was asked by Huizi, he said, whence do you know the happiness of fish? And Zhuangzi says, well, when I said that, I must have only known the happiness from up here. Saying, Zhuangzi is admitting, I only know it from my own perspective. Likewise, this is a classical philosophical problem. How do we know there are other minds? How do we know there are other beings that are like us, but different from us, separate completely? Well, at least from this kind of perspectivism that is being articulated by Zhuangzi, we only actually know that other minds exist, other real human beings, that they aren't, what's called philosophical zombies, or kind of like, robots without consciousness. We only ever seem to know on the basis of our own experience, of our perspective, that we basically map on to others. But if that's the case, then I can never actually know the world beyond my own experience. So the argument here is that no one can get beyond their own perspective to successfully argue against the perspective of another. And that's not what Zhuangzi did here. Zhuangzi did not argue Huizi is wrong. Zhuangzi just said, yes, of course, I'm saying the fish must be happy, but I'm saying that because that's my perspective. So here on page 12, there's an interesting way in which we might think about the metaphysics of something, of, like, let's say the happiness of a fish, and how we might know what, for example, happiness is. So Zhuangzi says, there is no being that is not that. Right? So that is anything we associate. We put a label on it, static, right? There's this cup. A cup is a that we refer to as a thing that is independent from other things. There is no being that is not a this, right? And so this and that are differentiated because we refer to one thing as a that and another as a this. But one cannot be seeing these from the perspective of that. One knows them only from this, i.e., one's own perspective. Thus, we can say that emerges from this, and this follows from that. So, when I say I know the glass of water here in front of me, I'm saying that this, as an independent thing, a cup of glass, I only know from this, which is this thing in front of me, that is generated from my perspective. So my perspective generates, then, my understanding of what I take to be an independent thing that must, exist with objective properties that are a glass, that other people could refer to as a glass as well. And that then informs further my own perspective. It kind of reinforces it. This is the theory of the simultaneous generation of this and that, Zhuangzi says. But by the same token, their simultaneous generation is their simultaneous destruction, and vice versa. Simultaneous affirmability is simultaneous negatability, and vice versa. What is circumstantially right is also circumstantially wrong, and vice versa. Thus, the sage does not proceed from any one of them alone, but instead lets them all bask in the broad daylight of heaven. And that, too, is only a case of going by the rightness of this present this. So what we have here is one, an argument about how opposites entail one another, right? Distinctions entail their opposite. But two, it would be ridiculous to suppose that there is any one correct perspective of such a thing, because we only know it from our own perspectives. And if there are multiplicity of perspectives, then we can never know outside of our own perspective if there is some objective, right, perspective. Although saying that an objective perspective is contradictory. So furthermore, he says, in a kind of like a metaphysical splitting up here of terms, this is also a that. That is also a this. That, capital T-H-A-T, posits a this and a that, a right and a wrong of its own, right? So we come up from our own perspectives of this sense of objectivity, because again, our own subjective experience entails objectivity as its opposite. But this, capital T-H-I-S, also posits a this and a that, a right and wrong of its own. So this sense in which there is a rightness in my own perspective, a kind of subjective relativism, we might want to think of it. So is there really any that versus this, and any right versus wrong? Or is there really no that versus this? When this and that, right and wrong, are no longer coupled as opposites, that is called the course as axis, or the way as axis, the axis of all courses. When this axis finds its place in the center, it responds to all the endless things it confronts, thwarted by none. For it has an endless supply of rights and an endless supply of wrongs. Thus, I say nothing compares to the illumination of the obvious. And here I like this this kind of a metaphor of like my own perspective is like the finger trying to point at itself and to know itself. To use this finger to show how a finger is not a finger is no match for using not this finger to show how a finger is not a finger, right? So imagine I'm using my other finger to show how this finger is not a finger. Well, it's still a finger. How does the finger know the other finger, just because it's not this finger, knows that this is not a finger? It's still from the same, in a sense, general perspective. It still hasn't gone outside of itself. It doesn't have, in a sense, a God's eye view of the objective reality of the finger and whether it's a finger or not. To use this horse to show that a horse is not a horse is no match for using not this horse to show that a horse is not a horse. Heaven and earth are one finger, all things are one horse. So, to have knowledge, right? To know that there is my perspective, and to say for certain it is different from your own, or that I have some objective experience of a thing, right? Where I can say you're wrong in your interpretation of that thing. I have to have knowledge of what it means to have knowledge. So not only do I have to know what knowledge is, I have to know, not only can I know something for sure, I have to know what it means to know something for sure. So, first, Zhuangzi says, the mind comes to be what it is by taking possession of whatever it selects out of the process of alternation. But does that mean it has to truly understand that process? The fool takes something up from it too. But to claim that there are any such things as right and wrong before they come to be fully formed in someone's mind in this way, that is like saying you left you today and arrived there yesterday. It's like, let's say we're in a courtroom, right? And we're on a jury. And let's say we are convinced, we like the kind of like wording that the lawyer is using to say someone is guilty. And we say, that person's guilty, right? And now it turns out that person actually is guilty. But I can't give an articulation of why that person is guilty. But let's say then, through further account by the lawyer, I learn that I can say, well, I know that person is guilty because there were 5 people that said they all saw that person committing the crime at the same time, and none of those people know each other, and they didn't know that person before, so none of them have interest, let's say, like, against that person. Now, that would be my justification for why I have knowledge of the guilt of that person, right? Because I can justify it, I can give reasons for it. But the question is, how do I know that giving reasons for it counts as knowledge? The problem here that Zhuangzi is pointing out is that to even say that I know that person is guilty, right, if I'm a juror in the courtroom, to say that means I have to know what knowledge is. But I can't have knowledge of what knowledge is without already knowing, therefore, what knowledge is. So knowledge of knowledge presupposes knowledge. It's a kind of paradox here. So the conditions for the possibility of knowledge are impossible because it requires that I already know what knowledge is before I come to know what knowledge is. So I'm going to read here on page 15, picking up from this distinction between this and that Zhuangzi was talking about earlier. So Zhuangzi says, now I will try some words here about this, perspectival knowledge, we might want to say. But I don't know if it belongs in the same category as this, or referred to as this, maybe perspective, or not. For belonging in a category and not belonging in that category themselves form a single category. So already, by trying to make sense of the knowledge I have from my own experience, already I'm dividing things up into categories. Now, do these cohere to some objective category of how things really can be broken up? Do I need to have knowledge of, the metaphysics of things as they actually, we might want to say objectively exist? Because if I don't have knowledge of, for example, what's the difference between a cup and a mug, before I start learning about what a cup and mug is, how could I ever learn what they are? if I don't already know the kind of categories that they would be able to be put into that make a distinction between what cups are and what mugs are. So he says, being similar is so similar to being dissimilar. So there is finally no way to keep it different from that, the this from that. Nevertheless, let me try to say it. There is a beginning, right? So there's a beginning of my experience. There is a not yet beginning to be a beginning, because if there is a beginning of my experience, then there must have been a time when there was a not yet beginning to the beginning of my experience. There is a not yet beginning to not yet begin to beginning to be non-existence. Or, sorry, to begin to be a beginning. Now, then if there is a beginning, then eventually there is existence. But if there is existence, then before the existence there was non-existence. There is a not yet beginning to be non-existence, because there must have been not only a non-existence, but a period before there was non-existence, which would have been the not yet beginning to be non-existence. There is a not yet beginning to not yet begin to be non-existence, which then must precede that. Suddenly, then there is non-existence. But I do not yet know whether the existence of non-existence is ultimately existence or non-existence. Now I've said something, but I do not yet know. Has what I have said really said anything, or has it not really said anything? Now the point is here, in a way, Zhuangzi has said something, and yet nothing. Because Zhuangzi has said something which is, well, look, when I start to say I know what a cup is, I have to break up all these different periods of, like, when I didn't know what a cup was, I have to have knowledge of when I didn't know what a cup was, what it is to be a cup, how cups are different from other things. In the same way that to say I have knowledge at all of what a cup is, I have to have known already what knowledge was before I could know, or before I could say I know what a cup is. Because I can't say I know what a cup is if I don't already know what knowledge is. So we already, from our own experiences, begin to suppose the opposites of when we begin to identify things and put labels on them. The question is, does that mean those labels are real? Or, once again, are they just perspectival? Are they just labels from my experience? But there's this kind of tension always back and forth between my experience and this supposition then that there is an objective experience which is distinct from my own, that then I want to make my own perspectival or subjective experience objective. So there are limits to our understanding. There are limits to the human mind, to what we can know. Everyone sees something from their own perspective. But we have awareness of someone else's perspective. Now, we don't have awareness of that other person's perspective as they see things. But we have an awareness that they have a perspective because we have a perspective that then we, looking at them, see it seems similar to our own, just like Zhuangzi talking about seeing that fish swim and how the fish looked happy. So we, in a sense, suppose they have a perspective, but we never actually know that perspective. Now, human beings disagree about things, and they disagree about important things, about things like morality, whether an action is morally acceptable or not, for example. There's disagreement everywhere. What do we make about this disagreement? Well, you should already know, based on this kind of perspectivism that Zhuangzi has been arguing, what we can make about it is that we can never claim any objective truth about any topic. So this is known as the argument from disagreement. So it begins with this first premise. 1. Disagreement about a certain topic is persistent and intractable. It's persistent and intractable because it's part of what it means to be a human being, is to always have one's own perspective. Now, second premise. The best explanation for the first premise is that there is no objective truth about that topic because there's no way to get beyond one's own perspective. Therefore, conclusion 1, there is no objective truth about whatever the topic is that human beings disagree about. Conclusion 2, therefore, skepticism or relativism about said topic is the appropriate consequence. So, one should be skeptical about claims to truth. One should embrace the customs that one is maybe born into. This doesn't mean the customs are correct, but it does mean they're no more correct than any other custom. One morality is no more correct than any other morality because we can't ever know if there is any such thing as an objectively true morality. This is the skepticism of the Zhuangzi.